In the city of Lumeris, light split the world like a blade. One light was gilded and public, chandeliers, polished smiles, faces measured in pale perfection. The other light lived in alleys and neon, in rooms that kept secrets and small mercies. It was under that second light that Evelyn Hale learned how to be invisible, and why invisibility could sometimes be a kind of armor. The cafe sat between two worlds. A wrought iron facade that caught the moon and a back door that smelled of flour and old coffee. Lanterns glowed with a warm, tired yellow. On the street outside, carriages bearing lacquered crests rolled past, crests of families older than memory. Inside, the midnight crowd was different. Late-shift clerks, hawkers, and the ones who preferred the anonymity of night. But the district they called Vampire Row, narrow streets and stone steps that rose like ribs, kept a different clientele. Pale patrons who moved with the hush of wings. Evelyn moved through the cafe like breath. She was 23, coal-dark skin that caught the lamp glow like polished onyx, hair braided close to her scalp, fingers calloused with years of cups and plates. She wore the standard, brown apron, plain blouse, but carried something richer by accident. A gentle, attentive gaze that noticed the small aches people tried to hide. They called her plain in a city that worshipped pallor. They clipped her name with little jokes that fell into the room like broken glass. Evelyn learned to fold comments into her apron the way she folded napkins, neatly, without looking. Mockery was a small thing until it was all you heard. It crept around her like cold fog, customers who mocked, colleagues who pretended not to see, patrons who pretended she didn't exist. She learned to make herself small so that nothing else would need to change. A man with a powdered face and a silver cuff glanced up and smirked. The line of his lip was a thin question. Evelyn's hands trembled, not from fear of him, but from the long ledger of small humiliations stacked like plates on her back. Her voice arrived in a slow, halting rhythm, small, imperfect. What can I get you? The stutter was a familiar rhythm. It had a name in her family that they said shyly, as if the sound itself were awkward. Evelyn's stammer. In a different life, one with less hunger and more books, she had taught children to read. In this life, she poured coffee and remembered the shapes of letters the way a weathered lighthouse remembers the coastline. Serve us quick. We don't have all night to listen to stories, one patron scoffed. Quick, someone else laughed, the sound like the clink of cheap glass. Evelyn set a cup down with hands that had learned balance and grace from repetition. The man raised the cup without meeting her eyes, a practiced dismissal. She stepped back and read the room, small, essential rituals. The way a man folded his hands when he was bluffing, the tremor in a woman's fingertips before she cried. She collected unspoken loneliness like spilled salt, and in secret she cataloged it. Behind the counter, the owner wiped a glass with a rag so old it could tell stories. He watched Evelyn with a calculation older than guilt and said quietly, "Don't start anything with the king's line. You hear? Keep your head down, Hale. We survive on not making trouble." "I know, sir," she answered, steady because the words had been filed and practiced. "King's line," people said, as if the royal family were a phantom in the rafters. In Lumeris, names were keys. King Aldrich, the kindly terrible monarch, noble houses whose children wore faces like masks, and lately, a rumor that had grown teeth. Across salons and doorways and the hushed pages of gossip, a whisper traveled. The vampire king's son dines in silence, mute, cursed, and untouchable. The rumor had the delicious cruelty of the court. It was both warning and spectacle. People loved the wrinkle of scandal. They loved to look away, then look again. "They say he sits with one hand on his throat and the other empty," a woman whispered to her friend. "They say he cannot speak because of a sickness of blood, and because he is of the king, no one dares to look." Untouchable. Imagine a prince who cannot speak. "It's poetic in a way," the friend replied, eyes wide. "Poetry for the powerful, cruelty for the poor." Evelyn listened to those whispers the way she listened to the clink of china, by feeling for the note that made the whole room tremble. The rumor did not change her shifts or her hours. It changed the way the cafe breathed. Patrons with paler faces and higher collars sent curt orders through the air, as if keeping a physical distance would keep them whole. On a rainy night, when the street lamps made the cobbles shine like a river of glass, Evelyn was refilling sugar jars. Her hands moved a familiar map across the counter. The bell over the door sang a small, ordinary note. The room stilled as if held. The door opened. He entered without the arrogance of those who knew they were feared. He moved with the slow, uncertain tread of someone taught to be careful even of his own shadow. His coat swallowed the light. His eyes were not quite black and not quite the silver of river stones. He did not speak. He did not need to. The room's attention peeled toward him like a tide. He chose the corner booth by the window where the rain painted the glass into blurry stars and folded his hands on the table as if keeping something fragile there. No one met his gaze. No one moved to wait on him. Chairs softened back into their places. Conversation dipped into hush. The roomer's name, mute, cursed, untouchable, hung in the air like smoke and settled on him with all the weight of inherited fear. Evelyn found herself watching the rules of distance unspool like thread from a spool she had never known she held. Her chest tightened for a breath that felt like the first after a long dive, equal parts dread and inexplicable curiosity. Around him, the cafe continued its rhythm of small cruelties and quiet survival. But in the corner, booth something fragile and strange settled, as if the city itself had leaned in to listen to a silence that finally sounded like someone's true voice. Rain hammered the windows like a dozen small drums, and the cafe smelled of steam and sugar, and that old, stubborn yeast smell that seemed to cling to Evelyn's sleeves. The storm made the lanterns bleed halos across the room. Shadows pooled in corners, and the city outside looked like a heart under pressure. The bell above the door sang a single, thin note, and everyone paused as though a conductor had raised his baton. He moved in as if reluctant to trust his feet. He was taller than she imagined, the coat swallowing the light, a collar turned up as if to guard a throat that had been punished. Moonlight pooled on his skin. His face was the soft, luminous kind of pale that turned every ordinary feature into something carved. Cheekbones like the edge of a coin. Lips that might once have been used for laughter. He did not meet anyone's eyes. He walked to the corner and sat as though he were folding himself into the furniture, making himself smaller to be less noticed. No one came to him. Conversation thinned into the careful hum of avoidance. The roomer, mute, cursed, untouchable, had teeth. Patrons shifted away in their seats the way one sidesteps a puddle. Servers crossed to the opposite side of the room, pretending not to see him. Fear had a bureaucratic efficiency in Lumeris. It moved people like pieces on a board. Evelyn felt the whole room's refusal like a pressure against her ribs. For a moment, she thought about following the owner's warning, keep your head down, keep your distance. But something in the way the stranger held himself, hands folded as if clutching a memory, pulled at the soft place inside her. The soft place that had once taught children to form letters with their fingers, that had once coaxed the smallest voices into speech. She took a slow breath and crossed the room. Her apron brushed the edge of the table. He looked up then, a fraction of an inch, and for a heartbeat his eyes were just two silvered stones, vacant, cautious. The storm outside made the room feel small and reckless, like any rules could be washed away. She set a steaming cup before him with a hand that trembled just enough to make the steam shiver. "Coffee," she said, voice a thread. He tilted his head, lips parting as if to say something he could not release. She saw the motion at his throat, a practiced, invisible gesture, the muscle of a voice reaching for air that would not come. He tried again. His mouth moved in careful syllables. The cafe had grown so used to whispers about a muted prince that no one even heard the sound he made, the soft rasp that might have been a word if the world allowed it. Evelyn leaned in, more by instinct than courage. Up close, the silence around him had texture. She could see the faint scar at the base of his throat, a pale line like a secret riverbed. He lifted his hand. It trembled. His fingers curled in a way that might have been a sign of gratitude, or a plea. She could not tell. He pushed his lips again. No sound came. His eyes were suddenly very young and very tired, not the cold, immortal gaze the stories promised, but the vulnerable look of someone whose life had been measured in measures that kept shrinking. Something in Evelyn's chest unclenched. Her fingers found their old language, the one she had taught children on winter afternoons, a set of smooth, practiced shapes shaped by patience and need. She did not think of the nobles and their rules. She did not think of Mr. Garrick's warning. She thought only of the hand in front of her and the human plea writ into its trembling. She signed the first word she trusted. Thank you. Her palms turned, fingers forming the arcs and taps she had used countless times to teach a shy child to respond. It was a small, private thing between two people under a roof of rain. The change in his face was immediate. The silver in his eyes flickered, as if a moth had remembered how to find light. He blinked, slowly, like the world had been translated for him in that one motion. His hand that had been poised in uncertainty fell into a careful mimicry of the shape she made, an answering gesture that trembled to life. He tried to form the word back, following her fingers as if they were a map. Evelyn smiled without meaning to, and the smile was a dangerous, generous thing in a place that measured advantage like currency. She signed again, this time a gentler set of motions. You are safe. It was a phrase that had once soothed small students when thunder frightened them. It felt absurdly small for a prince of a city where doors opened and closed on fates, but the absurdity was the point. Sometimes the world's reckonings bowed to the small, steady insistence of kindness. He watched her hands as if seeing color after a long winter. Tears collected at the corner of his eyes, impossible, like rain glass on bone, and something like a laugh trembled in his throat, muffled but present. He tried to make the sound again, and the attempt was a gust, a butterfly of noise caught in the net of silence. He placed two trembling fingers to his lips, and then against his heart, fingers splayed into a sign she knew as one for gratitude and wonder. Around them, the cafe was still a room of whispered rules. A man in the far corner folded his napkin with unusual aggression. A woman smirked and said, loudly enough for Evelyn to hear, "The boy's finally found himself a servant." The remark struck a small stone into Evelyn's stomach, but she let it sit. The world's small cruelties could not erase the conversation opening between the two of them. He began to sign back, awkward and halted, less the fluent rhythm of someone who had studied linguistics, and more the defensive, earnest forming of shapes learned in desperation. Evelyn answered each new tumble of fingers with a patient translation, fingers shaping safety and time, and the quiet, earnest questions that can exist without words. He showed her his name with a written slip he produced and set between them, letters as neat as any scholar's, Lucien Vale. The name carried a hush across the room, the rumor sharpened into reality. For a moment, the cafe forgot itself and watched the exchange as if it were a play where an unlikely tenderness had the right to be witnessed. Evelyn wrote her name in return on the back of a sugar packet, Evelyn Hale, and tucked it toward him like a pledge. He traced the letters with a finger, careful as a priest handling scripture. His eyes widened again, and for the first time there was a glint that might be called recognition or the first bloom of hope. When the storm finally eased and the rain slowed to a steady drum, Lucien rose to leave. His movement was grateful and graceless, like someone who had not practiced the act of going on for some time. Before he stepped into the street's wet light, he turned and signed one last thing. "May I come again?" Evelyn's hand answered without thinking, "Yes." The word unspooled between them like a promise. Around them, the city hummed its old, indifferent song. But for a moment the midnight cafe held a small, stubborn thing. Two people building a language where none had been permitted. Night after night, the cafe settled around them like a shell, a private orbit within the city's noise. The rain stopped or started, carriages passed or did not. Inside, lamps hummed and the air tasted of coffee and sugar. Lucien came as he had promised, and each time he came the silence he carried felt less like an accusation and more like a landscape they could wander together. They began with the smallest things. Evelyn signed the names of spices as she refilled jars, the practiced curves of the alphabet she had once traced on slate with children's chalk. Lucien watched her hands with the attentive hunger of someone learning a new language of survival. He answered in careful, awkward shapes at first, like a man teaching his fingers how to obey again. Each new sign he formed had the concentration of someone relearning speech through skin. He was intelligent in a way that made Evelyn's chest ache, quietly keen, curious about words and history, about the way people kept secrets in plain sight. When he wanted to show that he understood a story she told, his fingers would make a small, precise motion, and his eyes would crumple into something almost like laughter. He had a habit of tilting his head as if listening to a song only he could hear, and when he smiled it altered him. The carved places on his face softened, and the light in the cafe seemed to gather there. Their conversations were a stitchwork of gestures and written scraps. He carried a small leather notebook he pressed across the table when his signs wanted context. Sketches of places he remembered, names of books he had read, a hurried, elegant script that betrayed a life of private study. Evelyn wrote back on napkins, on sugar packets, on the backs of broken plates. She told him of the children she had taught once in a church-room with more dust than daylight, of the way letters clumped like shy birds when a child learned to read. He told her, in the careful shorthand of a man who had learned to conserve words, that he had loved music once, the kind that rose from violins and spoke of summers, and that he had been in rooms where the air smelled of roses and paper. One night, beneath a lamp that buzzed like a tired insect, he wrote a single line and then stopped, as if the pen were a live thing. The handwriting trembled. There was a rebellion, he wrote. Humans came into the estate and set the West Wing ablaze. My mother was there. I ran. I called. The smoke caught my voice. Evelyn read the words twice. The world in the cafe narrowed until it was only the two of them and that strip of paper. He touched the scar at his throat one finger at a time, tracing the pale ridge as if measuring the distance between then and now. There was no melodrama in his telling, only a tired arithmetic of loss. His mother had been a woman who moved like moonlight across gardens. When the revolt burned a house, it had also burned the space where a boy could be a boy. The voice that had once been his was gone not just by wound, but by the way the city turned its back, and by the decisions people in darker rooms had made. Evelyn reached for his hand without thinking. His fingers were cool but warm with a life that widened as he accepted contact. He signed a few hesitant things, memory, smoke, regret, and his hands moved with a brittle grace that left Evelyn's heart both broken and resolute. She told him, fingers forming slow and sure, that wounds could be tended. She could not promise magic, but she could promise presence. He nodded as if the nod could anchor him. She told him about the church-room where children learned to sound letters, and how poverty had pushed her toward the cafe counter. She had kept a small buoy of hope in the shape of lesson plans, in the way she'd trimmed paper into little vowels and consonants that fit together like puzzle pieces for hungry minds. Poverty had been a slow, patient thief. First it took hours to sleep, then afternoons, then the idea of a different life. She signed the shapes of books and ink-stained fingers and the name of a child who had once sat afraid and then learned to say mother without trembling. Lucien listened the way nobles listen to confessions, not with judgment, but with the rapt attention of someone who had never been allowed to know the mundane, human things that make other people whole. He traced the letters she wrote and asked questions with his eyes, until Evelyn sometimes felt as if she were teaching again. Only this time the student came from marble halls and moonlit corridors. Their bond deepened through the small betrayals of time. A shared umbrella when rain surprised them on the street, a pressed wildflower left on the sugar bowl, a napkin folded into the shape of a bird. Lucien learned to sign faster. His fingers stopped arresting in the air and began to move with a rhythm that made Evelyn's chest unclench. She taught him idioms. I am tired, and I was brave, and you are not alone. And he taught her gestures for things she had never considered asking. The sign for loneliness that folded inward like a shell, the sign for fear that snapped like a twig. Even as their intimacy grew, the world around them watched in a way that tasted of salt and rust. Patrons who had once ignored Evelyn now whispered scornful things when Lucien entered, as if proximity to a prince could stain. He attracted more than curiosity. He attracted the lattice of class and blood that girded Lumeris. Some nights a pale-faced woman at the far table would scoff loudly enough that Evelyn heard. A royal's favor for a gutter girl. How quaint. Others muttered that the prince was being naive, or worse, weak. But there were gestures of support too, small and furtive. A baker left an extra roll on the counter with a wink. A former student came in one evening with a hand-sewn bookmark and a quick, proud smile. The cafe itself seemed to conspire, its lamps throwing softer light, its tables arranging themselves into less hostile shapes. People began to look, hesitantly, at the conversation passing in gestures at the corner booth, an exchange that was more human than rumor and more stubborn than fear. One rainy week, when a rumor coursed through the district that Lucien's father might forbid him from coming back, Evelyn found herself waiting by the door an hour after her shift ended. The street was empty except for the echo of carriage wheels. When Lucien arrived, he carried with him a small, battered book. Inside, on the first page, he had written a single dedication in a hand as careful as his signs. To Evelyn, who taught me how to hear without sound. She touched the inscription with a reverence that felt like prayer. In his palms, the book was neither royal prize nor relic. It was a promise folded into paper. They sat together until the lamps outside smoked into dawn, signing words that had no need of voice and building, with patient, stubborn hands, a language that could not be burned. The cafe had never been merely a place that served hot drinks. It was a ledger of debts and favors, a small economy of risk. Now every page of that ledger seemed to carry the small, sharp print of gossip. The rumor that had once been a distant thing on the lips of carriage passengers had slipped inside the room and taken up a seat of its own. People leaned toward it, as if it offered a sweeter taste than the coffee. A waitress speaking to royal blood, a pale woman snorted, the words falling like coins too heavy for anyone to pick up. Do you know what that does to a girl's prospects? Prospects, a man whispered behind a veil of cigarette smoke. It stains, the very idea of it will stick. Their laughter was soft and practiced, an art form that protected privilege. Evelyn heard the shapes of the phrases long before she felt their edge. She felt them as pressure under her ribs, the old, familiar weight of being measured and found wanting. Yet when she crossed to the corner booth each night and laid down the cup of coffee with a tremor that had become steadier with practice, she also felt something else, a quiet permission that came from the boy with the scar and the unreadable name. The owner took her aside one late evening, his voice a dusted thing, easy from years of keeping quiet. "Do not look him in the eyes again. It's forbidden," he said, as if speaking the rule aloud could bind it back into place. His face was a map of transactions and small sins. "We run on customers who prefer not to have trouble. Royal trouble is the worst, opens accounts no one wants." She stood very still, feeling the cafe around her, the lamps like eyes. "I know," she told him, because she had learned how to answer without giving up the truth. But inside, the answer was a knot of fear and impatience that would not be smoothed. When Lucien came that night, he had done something that surprised even the whisper-hungry room. He walked past the court guards posted like dull trophies at the gabled gate and straight down the narrow lane that led to the cafe. The guard's complaint had been lodged. You know the rules, prince. But the prince's refusal of their enforcement was quieter than a defiance shouted. It was a refusal to be moved like a pawn. He slipped by the men with the practiced ease of someone who knew the particular geography of loneliness and had learned secrets about doors. He sat at the corner booth like a held breath and placed his hands on the table. The guards, sensing that a line had been bent, tightened their collars and turned away. In that small loosening of discipline, the room found a new rhythm. Shock, then whispering resentment, then the curious, thudding hush of interest. He signed to her across the table with a speed that had grown surer by the week. The movement was economical, not showy. It held the particular economy of someone who'd been taught to save gestures for the things that mattered. "You're the only one who sees me." It was not a boast. It was an ache turned into a shape. Evelyn's throat made a small sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. She watched his fingers, the way a man might study the face of a tide he had once thought unchangeable. "And you're the only one who listens," she responded, and the words came out of her not as a defense, but as a benediction. Their hands hovered above the table for a long moment, separated by napkins and a sugar bowl, but joined by the small web of glances and gestures they had made between them. The promise in those hands was not dramatic. It was the mercantile sort, faith exchanged for presence. It was simple, and because it was simple it felt dangerous in a room that had so wholly loved complexity when it protected power. The The cafe's other patrons noticed the exchange with the petty rage of those who have found the world, standing in the wrong place for their taste. A noble laughed too loudly. Another woman made a face like someone who discovered a smudge on expensive silk. The undercurrent that ran through the room was not merely class. It was a genealogy of shame, the way bloodlines had taught people which faces were permitted to be close to which crowns. Rumors migrated faster than sense. "He's being used," someone hissed. "Royal pity, nothing more," said another. The language of scapegoating rearranged itself to fit the truth they would rather not accept. A prince seeking comfort from a woman, the city had decided, was unworthy. Evelyn felt the walls narrowing. She felt the margin between kindness and survival tighten into something razor-edged. The owner's warning hung around her like a new collar. She caught herself thinking of the ledger again, the accounts of favors and blows that people kept with themselves. If a noble chose to press advantage, what could a brown-aproned girl do? The answer, as always, thinned into the same small thing. Keep your head down, keep your hands moving. Lucien watched her read the room. He had learned the anatomy of humiliation by degrees. He understood the maps of patronage that bent people's spines. There was a softness in his eyes when he signed next, an offering instead of a command. "I will take some of the weight." She waved him off with a gesture half playful and half real. "You cannot carry my life for me." She meant it both as protest and as truth. They had each their territories of pain. But when he slid a pale, folded scrap of paper toward her, a menu he'd annotated with a childish note. "Favorite at table 9. Bread," she folded the paper and kept it. The world's cruelty did not always come in blows. Sometimes it arrived in the small decisions of who was permitted to speak and who was not. As the nights passed, alliances in the room rearranged with the slow logic of weather. Some regulars, who had once sneered, began to glance their way with curiosity that could become softer in time. A baker who morning shifted at the corner stall left rolls wrapped in napkins for Evelyn. A woman who taught embroidery slipped by to ask about the signs for colors. Small kindnesses, tradespeople's currency, moved like a tide gently seeking its shore. But the tension was not merely social. Whispers reached ears that mattered. A diplomat's aide took note. A servant in the palace told a cousin over the hearth. Rumor flowed to rooms with heavier drapes and faces more accustomed to ordering things into being. The whisper of bloodlines carries weight not because it is true, but because it can be used. Power remembers that it is threatened when compassion looks like preference. One evening, as Evelyn scrubbed a stubborn ring of tea from a saucer, a thin-faced man with a family crest pin came into the cafe. He sat deliberately near the corner booth and watched Lucien with the intent of someone cataloging an asset. He leaned in and, in a voice like a fine wire, said enough for Evelyn to hear. "You're making the prince soft." That's not a good look for him or for the kingdom. His words were measured. They were not only a caution, they were a reminder that the city had long ago taught people that affection could be weaponized. Evelyn felt the heat rise in her face, not from shame, but from the anger of being spoken about like an object in someone else's ledger. Lucien looked at the man and signed without haste, the gesture a small, intimate sermon. "You cannot make me soft. I learned to live like this, and I choose otherwise." Those were the motions. They were not defiant in a theatrical way, but plain and true as bread on a table. The man with the pins smiled as if he had closed a book on them. He left a coin on the table, a deliberate, patronizing gift, and walked out. That coin clinked into the tray like an accusation. Evelyn felt it in her pocket for the rest of the night like a stone. When the lights clicked off and the last patron shuffled into the rain, the two of them sat and counted the cost of a small kindness. The candle between them guttered. Shadows pooled and started to look like eyes. Outside, a carriage rolled away, its whisper a sound like fate consulting its ledger. "I will come again," Lucien signed finally, and the motion held both a promise and a caution. Evelyn nodded. Her hands answered. "Then we will keep talking." They did not know then how closely the city's ledger kept watch, or how quickly a line crossed in faint ink might become a sentence in broad script. They only knew the truth that had become simple and necessary. In a world where people were sorted by light and by blood, Two people had found a way to speak without being spoken over. That was enough for now, and that was dangerous enough to start a fracture. The royal hall smelled of roses and old money, of waxed wood and perfumes that moved like veils. Crystal chandeliers spilled cool light in faceted rain across long tables where carved chairbacks resembled the ribs of sleeping beasts. Tonight, the city had gathered its most gilded faces, nobles whose laughter was a practiced thing, ambassadors with smiles like knives, and courtiers who measured one another in silk folds. The banquet was a pageant of power. Courses layered on silver platters, musicians playing in a corner whose notes curved like smoke, and servants who moved with the smooth, invisible precision of things that knew their places. Evelyn stood at the periphery of that glittering choreography, apron tied tight, palms damp from carrying trays. Her world had never been carved from the same marble as these halls. She had been taught to move like a shadow that never spoke its name. When she crossed from the margins into the center of that room, it felt like walking a tightrope in shoes that had never been broken in. The nobles watched, not with curiosity but with the indulgent cruelty that comes to those unused to being inconvenienced. They catalogued her like an exhibit, the color of her skin, the stutter in her voice, the way she refused to be smaller than she already was. "Keep your head down and your hands steady," someone on the staff hissed as she passed. "No foolishness. This is a show for power." She kept her head down and kept her hands steady until one of those proud faces decided the show needed more amusement. A noble with a forked laugh and sleeves beading with jewels raised his goblet as if to toast. He watched Evelyn set plates with the casual concentration of someone arranging a pet on a table. Then, for the small thrill of cruelty, he tipped his goblet so that a ripple of wine arced like a small comet and spilled across her apron and onto her forearm. The room's noise collapsed into a pointed silence. "Ah, look at that," he said theatrically, his voice oiled and smooth. "Tell the poor thing to dry herself. She'll want to be presentable for the prince, won't she?" Laughter curled behind him like smoke. "Perhaps the prince prefers his comfort served with a human at his feet." Someone near him, an older woman with nails painted the color of winter, leaned forward and said, loud enough for the nearest servers to hear, "Mute lover, is it? How poetic. He can't speak, but someone can speak for him. How charitable." The words landed on Evelyn as if thrown, sharp and deliberate. Heat flared in her face, not the heat of anger so much as the hot, clinging ash of humiliation. Her hands stiffened on the tray. She had been taught to carry shame like a second skin, but being named for it in front of so many sharpened the pain to an almost physical throb. Across the room, Lucien sat in half-light like someone carved from moonstone, his hands folded, notebook closed on his lap. For weeks, his silence had stood like a wall around him, an edifice people peered at and whispered about. Tonight, sight turned into a pinprick of ache. He watched the spill, watched the laugh, watched the use of her as a toy. The muscles at his jaw tightened in a manner that made him look suddenly human in the most vulnerable of ways. Raw, exposed, furious. He rose. The motion was small but seismic. Chairs scraped. A servant paused mid-step. Lucien's movement was a break in the choreography the court expected. Sons of kings did not stand to answer insults aimed at the lowly. They acted by decree and distance. They did not touch. He crossed the marble floor as if walked by a current only he could feel, and when he moved the hall seemed to hold its breath. The noble who had made the jest smiled like a cat before it strikes. "Ah, Prince," he purred, a false warmth that was guttered by malice. "You should remember your place. Your presence is," a pulse of sound stopped, as if hand had been laid on the throat of the world. Forks paused midair. The cellist's bow froze just above a string. A maid's laughter hung like a bubble in the air, perfect and unmoving. The chandelier's crystals caught a frozen light and shone in a dozen still faces. Even the spilled wine seemed to pause, a bead suspended in the silent theater of a single, terrible moment. It was not the hall that paused as much as time itself. The royal power manifested in the king's will, a subtle theft of motion that left the scene curdled into an impossible, breathless tableau. The sudden immobility had a soundlessness that was loud enough to bruise. Lucien, alone in the shifting hush, looked up toward the high dais where King Aldrich sat like a mountain of composed decisions. The king's voice rolled out without the usual noise of movement, an ancient thunder that filled the frozen air. "Lucien," he said, and even in that unnatural stillness the syllable was a sentence. "Love is a weakness," he intoned, each word a cold star. "You are the heir to a line that remembers its teeth. Do not let sentiment rot you. Mortal affection will take you from duty." The words landed like a verdict. The stillness broke on an invisible seam, and people moved again as if waking from a spell. The chandelier swayed. The wine sloshed and finally fell, crimson pooling on embroidered cloth. As motion reasserted itself, the hall became a beast again, louder, angrier, the servants' eyes a mixture of fear and relief at the king's asserted order. Lucien's face was white as carved bone, but with a fire beneath that white. It was not merely embarrassment he felt. It was grief and rage braided into one shape. He took a step forward like a man stepping off the edge of what was permitted, and in that step the hall seemed to recoil with the knowledge of consequence. King Aldrich's warning hung in the air like a bar across a throat. Yet something in Lucien had been broken by the sight of Evelyn made spectacle, some private promise of dignity ruptured by the spectacle of mockery. He crossed the room and placed a hand at Evelyn's shoulder, gentle, impossible. For a breath, they were two people caught in a world that wanted them separated by every rule. He signed with a fierceness that trembled, "Forgive me." Evelyn met his eyes and saw not the cold prince the stories promised, but the boy who had been taught to hide tenderness. She saw pressure there like a weathered stone and chose, in one balanced instant, to act not with shame, but with the small, steady dignity that had always been her armor. She straightened the soiled apron and lifted her chin. Her voice, when she spoke, was small but steady. "It's fine," she said, the words tight as wire. "I have spilled worse." The nobles murmured. Someone called her insolence a dangerous virtue. A guard's hand brushed Lucien's sleeve, an unspoken reminder that rebellion had its price. The king's eyes, from the dais, were twin knives. His voice had already mapped the consequences. The hall seethed with 1,000 small judgments like bees in a hive. That night, the palace corridors felt different to Lucien. The air was sharper, as if the walls themselves whispered what price a child had to pay to learn compassion. He fled the dinner early under the excuse of a headache, moving through corridors lined with portraits that watched him with the disappointment of ancestors. Servants murmured. A cloak boy looked at him with something like pity and something like fear. At the gates he paused, listening to the city breathe beyond the stone. And then he ran, simple, unadorned flight that felt less like escape, and more like the urgent pulling toward someone whose dignity had simply been trampled. He ran through streets baptized in a fine, cleansing rain, until the city's darker lanes welcomed him. He pushed open the cafe door with hands that had trembled much for reasons older than tonight, and found the warm buzz of light and the steady smell of coffee like a hand that held him. Evelyn stood there, apron folded against her chest, eyes rimmed with salt and the stubborn light of someone who had refused humiliation's power. He leaned against the door frame, soaked and shaking. He could not speak then, words had been marked in the palace with iron, but his eyes pleaded in ways that no decree could silence. He signed once, the motion raw and unpracticed. I tried. He had failed the world's rules and followed the rules of his heart instead. In that small, impromptu sanctuary, the two of them let the sound of rain on the window stitch them together, and for a fragile moment, the world's magistrates and whispers seemed far away. Rain made the window a sheet of liquid glass, and the cafe smelled like wet wool and something sweet that always clung to Evelyn's apron, sugar and lemon peel and a faint trace of last week's stew. Lucien stood by the door with water beating like glass beads along his coat. He was both smaller and stranger up close, as if the palace had carved him from moonlight and left rough edges where flesh should be. He held his notebook to his chest with both hands, as if it were the only thing keeping his ribs from spilling out. He did not look like a prince of rumor then. He looked like a man who had been apprenticed to sorrow and learned the craft well. Evelyn took his wet hand without thinking. It was cool, clammy at the thumb, but when she pressed her palm against his fingers, there was a faint tremor, fear braided with something like relief. He sat down heavily at the corner booth. notebook falling open to pages of neat script and half-finished sketches. This was the book he used when words refused to cross his throat. Lists of books he could not discuss aloud, maps of streets where he felt safe, sentences the palace would have preferred remain unwritten. He turned the book so she could see, and he used a pen with a blunt, careful virtue to write 2 words, then stopped as if the ink had to be treated like a live thing. He scribbled, "My voice was taken." Her throat closed on a breath that tasted of iron. She reached for the page and read the cramped handwriting twice, as if the second reading might be less cruel. Then he pushed the book away, and with hands that shook, rolled back the collar of his coat. The skin at the base of his throat was a pale riverbed, a pale crescent of scar that unfurled like a map to some old wound. The skin there was puckered and slightly darker than the rest, an old seam that might have once been a wound, then stitched, then sealed with something colder than stitches. He pointed to the mark and then, in a small, deliberate motion, pressed a finger to the scar as if to show where something invisible had been removed. He signed, slow and careful, building the shape as a teacher would form a letter for a child who would not give up trying. His fingers asked for the thing he could not say. Why? Evelyn had learned his hands enough to understand tone, even without the swift fluency they developed together. The motion trembled with a history, anger folded into exhaustion, pride threaded with grief. He tapped at the scar again and then produced from his coat a scrap of paper, folded until its edges were soft. On it, in a hand that slanted like a ladder, was a single line, a binding, King's seal, blood-right. He tapped the seal as if to underline the cruelty of lineage, then wrote a single phrase with an economy that made her stomach drop when she read it. He shall not speak love to mortals. The 4 words were stark, a legal death notice for tenderness. The sentence explained why his attempts at words had been a rasp, why the throat's muscle moved and air did not sing. It explained why the city had spoken of him as cursed. It read like a law that had been written on skin and enforced by centuries of ceremony. Evelyn's fingers found his scar before her brain had approved the motion. She touched the ridge with the careful curiosity one uses when exploring a child's fever, gentle, clinical, more concerned than sentimental. The scar was cool, almost slick from the rain, ridged as if threads of old magic had knotted beneath the skin. At her touch, Lucien's whole body shivered, like someone struck by a memory. He looked at her then with a clarity that made her think of winter light, clear and too bright. He signed a complicated series of motions, then lay his hand flat over hers on the scar and let his thumb rest there, like a governor easing a gate. He was asking for something that had nothing to do with protocol or palace rules. It was an asking born of the simple arithmetic of need. She had been a teacher once. She knew the slow, patient miracles of repetition. When she pressed her palm again, she did not try to chant or weave words. She whispered instead, half to herself, half to the scar, as if the sound could be a salve. "I'm here," she said, and the syllables were modest as coins. The cafe seemed to hush toward them the same way it had when they had first learned sign. Rain tapped the roof like a patient hand. The effect was not immediate and not theatrical. There was no great unbinding like a bolt of lightning. What happened was humbler and therefore more terrifying. The scar warmed beneath her touch, first like a sliver of sunlight through a chink in a door, and then like a pulse. Light in the cafe guttered once, twice, as if remembering a rhythm it had forgotten. The little lamp over the corner booth shivered and then threw off a prismatic flicker that splintered across the table, catching in the crystal sugar jar and throwing tiny rainbows like bookmarks. Lucien's breath came in a new way, more like a remembered instrument being tuned than the short, clipped respites he'd managed before. His lips parted with the tension of someone testing stitches, and for a moment Evelyn's life narrowed to the sight of his throat, to the small, miraculous motion of a word trying to push through skin that had been taught not to yield. Then he whispered her name. "Evelyn!" The sound was small, sanded at the edges by absence, but it was a sound, and it landed in her chest like a coin she had been saving for years. It was the first word he had made aloud in the presence of other people, since the night the palace lost him. It was the word that made the air rearrange itself. The cafe's ordinary hum folded for an instant into something like worship. Evelyn's tears came without permission. They were not the theatrical tears of sorrow, but the kind that taste of salt and surprise. She reached up and cupped his face with both hands, as if the act were a holy thing and she a supplicant at the altar. Her thumbs smudged rain across his cheekbone. He closed his eyes at her touch like a child trusting a story. He tried again to speak, and this time his voice was less like a breath and more like a thread, still thin but continuous. He said her name again, and this time there was an almost smile in it, a sound so small it could have been swallowed by the world if the world had wanted to be cruel. But the world did not take it back. The cafe did not explode in scandal. Instead, lights trembled in sympathy, and somewhere in the back a spoon fell with a quiet clink and was left where it lay. The magic that knotted his throat was old and bitter as winter bark, binding not only muscle but decree to memory. Evelyn's touch had not undone it wholly. Nothing could when the king's will had been written into flesh, but it had loosened the stitch enough for a single syllable to escape. If pain was a locked door, then her compassion had been a key turned not by strength but by fidelity. He opened his eyes and found hers, and the room folded itself like paper around the two of them. There was awe there, and something that knew, terrifyingly and wonderfully, that consequence would come. He signed weakly, words laced with both reverence and fear. "I am yours," in the way someone might sign a vow when speech is forbidden. Evelyn laughed then, a sound that was wet and astonished, and answered in the only language she had for vows at that moment. She laid her forehead against his, a touch that sealed and promised in a single, ridiculous, necessary motion. Their hands tightened over the scar. The sugar jar caught the prismatic light and scattered it like a scattering of small flags. Outside, the city continued being a city. Carriages rolled, drunks sang, and someone in a bar banged out a rhythm on a table. Inside, two people had folded a new grammar between them. One word spoken, many unspoken, and a binding that had been slightly, quietly broken by the gentleness of a hand. A forbidden thing had begun, not with thunder but with a whisper, and the whisper carried in it a weather that would, inevitably, change the forecast. They came like formal thunder, armored steps that swallowed the cafe's warm hush. A pair of palace guards entered without the soft caution of a customer, and with all the certainty of men who had been trained to move as the king's shadow. The room froze. Cups paused midway to mouths. Conversations thinned to an awful curiosity. "We have an order from the palace," one of them announced, voice like iron rubbed on velvet. "Evelyn Hale, by command of His Majesty, you are to present yourself at the Hall of Ashes forthwith." Her name cut through the little private world she had built at the corner booth. Lucien's hand, which had been resting on the table, tightened into something like a fist. He rose as if to stand with her, and for a heartbeat the hope of that motion lit the cafe like a match. They led her out the back, not with a rope but with the weight of law arranged into polite hands. The streets she knew by touch and smell felt suddenly strange, like a story read backward. Word moved faster than carriage wheels. By the time she reached the palace, banners that had always meant ceremony now looked like tribunals. The Hall of Ashes loomed larger than memory, its ceiling a carved sea of ancestors, its aisles wide enough to fit a life's worth of verdicts. Nobles filled the benches like a congregation of carved ivory. King Aldrich sat on his dais as if he had been carved last and warmed by his own decision. Lucien's guards stood arrayed like question marks, their faces carefully neutral. Evelyn's hands were folded as if she might be able to smooth consequences into squares. "You are accused of enchanting my son," a steward intoned, the accusation laid out like a ledger entry. "You are accused of using witchcraft, of binding the blood of the heir to your will. How do you plead?" A murmur rippled through the hall, some of it anticipation, some of it appetite. To accuse a human of enchanting a royal was not merely scandal. It was a tool. The nobles arched their eyebrows as if the right expression could slice a truth into pieces. Evelyn's mouth was dry. She remembered the kitchen's heat, the small prayers she had learned on the back of napkins, the children she had taught who practiced their letters with determined fingers. Enchantress. Someone had placed the word like a crown on her head and expected it to sit. She had nothing but the truth she carried in her hands and the sign language they had taught one another. The guards shifted like animals, sensing the gap between law and story. Lucien stood then, not at the front, because the servant's place did not suit him tonight, but where every heartbeat of the hall could see the way his spine had straightened. "My son," King Aldrich said slowly, like a man testing the weight of a name. "I will not have my household sullied by scandal. You speak for him." Lucien stepped forward. He did not kneel. He lifted his hands the way he always did when he spoke with Evelyn, carefully, as if words were delicate things that could be dropped. The motion was plain and desperate and quiet. "You must listen." The king's eyes narrowed. "You will stand down, Lucien. Do not make a spectacle." Lucien's fingers moved, and the court watched the small storm of gestures. He signed, not into air but into the space between them, pleading and accusing and pleading again. The guards moved closer. The steward planted his cuffs between Evelyn and the prince, a physical punctuation to remind everyone of rank. Evelyn's breath came in shallow measures. Her throat felt like a drum wrapped in gauze. She could have said nothing. Silence would have been kinder and safer. But she had watched Lucien's hands shape truths into the air until the only language she trusted for him was the one that bled into her palms. She had never been one for spectacle, but she had always known how a single voice could move a tide. She stood, her knees threatened rebellion, but she held them at bay. "I will speak," she said, and the words were small, as if gathered from beneath a stack of plates. The hall leaned in. Lucien signed again, this time with a kind of rhythm that had been trained by years of taught restraint. "You made me quiet. You put the seal." He traced the motion across his throat and then lifted his hands to the air where the court's faces hovered like birds of a single species, white, sharp, unforgiving. Evelyn's hands translated his fingers into sound because she had promised to listen, and because the terrible truth needed more than the hush of a corner booth. She told them what he had signed, loud enough for everyone to hear. He was not cursed by fate. He was silenced by cruelty. His voice was taken by a right, a binding performed in a room that called itself protection. The words dropped like stones into the hall's polished pool. Some faces puckered with disapproval as if they had tasted sour wine. Others looked shocked, as though a ledger had been unaccountably opened. The steward cleared his throat. The king's jaw tightened. Accusations are practical things until they become human truths, and then they threaten those who rely on their neatness. King Aldrich's voice rolled across the marble with the weight of an old bell. "Do you accuse me?" he asked, but the bell tasted different now. There was an old sorrow under his formality that made the question more dangerous than it might have been. Lucien signed, each motion a map to a wound. "You taught me to put duty first. You taught me silence. You taught me that mercy was a leak in the hull." His hands were not violent. They were careful, like a man unlearning a script he had been reciting his whole life. "You would tell the court that your king, my king, silenced you," the steward demanded, lips curling. "That is treasonous." "No," Lucien signed, slow and terrible with accumulation. "I say it so that no more children are taught silence as a lesson." The motion broke like thin ice under the hall's bright shoes. King Aldrich lunged then, not with fists but with the old, imperial rhetoric. "Love makes monsters weak," he declared, voice echoing like a blade. "I built a line that remembers its bite. Those who would place sentiment over survival will learn what it means to be a failed heir." The words were an attempt to compress a world. A weaponized creed dressed as care. Evelyn felt them like hands at her jaw. The nobles stirred, the ones who had built their fortunes on order and small cruelties nodding as if comforted. "He must be taught," one whispered. "He must know the price of weakness." Lucien had paper in his palm. He unfolded a page and, shaking, pointed to a line. He had been taught to keep record even when speech failed him. Now his notebook was a denunciation. He signed the words that punched like fists against old stone. "You silenced me, not the curse." It was not hysteria that wrapped round his fingers, but a patient, terrible clarity. He tapped the page as if proof could be engraved upon air. Evelyn felt something hot and fragile rise in her chest, an anger that tasted of all the meals eaten in silence, of all the times the world had mistaken quiet for absence. She had been accused of enchantment, of witchcraft, but the real charm in the room was the habit of hiding cruelty beneath etiquette. If naming it out loud could peel away the pretense, Then she would do it with the clumsiness of a servant and the courage of a woman who had taught children to form the word brave. She stepped closer to Lucien and let his signs fill her like a script she had learned breath by breath. She translated the motion without embellishment, without gilding. He was never cursed. He was silenced by cruelty. His voice was taken in the name of lineage and fear. The hall erupted like a struck horn. Outrage and denial hit first, voices raised in quick, practiced waves to drown the inconvenient. Eyes that had never had to ask for forgiveness suddenly sought the safe rooms of policy and precedent. A noblewoman's hand flew to her mouth. "Preposterous!" someone shouted. "The king would not." Another voice was quieter but colder. "And if these accusations are true, what does that make the man who allowed it? A protector or a jailer?" King Aldrich's face was a sculpture in motion, muscles flexing, color changing like weather. He had ruled with the logic of attrition. Weaken the soft, safeguard the line. To have that foundation named publicly, plainly, was like having a beam pulled from the throne room floor. He tried to reclaim ground with command, but command works best when people already believe the ground beneath it. Lucien felt the change ripple through the room. He opened his mouth as if to speak, and this time sound rushed out. Not a single syllable, but a stream, the beginning of a voice that had been finding its way back like a lost river rejoining its delta. It started as a cracked thing, then widened. "Father," he said, and the name held both address and accusation. The sound was raw and splendid, and the hall fell into a different silence, one bought with the currency of shock. Evelyn stood on trembling legs and watched as the man she loved found a voice not by decree, but by the stubborn, public truth they had called across him. The binding had not been fully unmade. Ancient rights are not undone by a single human heart, but the stitch had been loosened enough that what was true could be heard. Lucien spoke again, clearer. "You taught me to be small for the crown. You made me forget that mercy was strength." King Aldrich's lips thinned. For a moment, the weight of kingship and the weight of a father tangled on his face, and he looked, absurdly and painfully, just like a man who had been asked a question he could not answer. The nobles did not know whether to roar for their king or for the scandal. Some rose to denounce the accusation as the momentary folly of an unbalanced heir. Others, quieter and cleverer, leaned in, smelling the opportunity to advance, to rewrite alliances. Evelyn felt the world tilt beneath her, but not like falling, like an overturning that revealed an underside that needed tending. The guards at her wrists loosened. Some of them looked ashamed for the first time. The steward searched for a statute to hang over the conversation like a net. In that shifting, Lucien's voice found footing and anchored itself, not merely to prove his existence, but to alter the way the hall conceived of speech and silence. When he spoke next, his voice had new texture, gravel and river, and something that could in future be gentled by laughter. "Let them hear," he said. "If silence was used as punishment, we will remove its lessons. If cruelty was called protection, we name it what it is." King Aldrich rose, slow as a weathered tree creaking in storm. He could have crushed them both in a dozen subtle ways: banishment, exile, a sealed decree that would dissolve them into a footnote. Power affords many quiet cruelties. But the public confession, the way Evelyn had made his son's namelessness legible, had shifted the hall's geometry. The king found himself negotiating not between obedience and rebellion, but between two stories. The story he had told about strength, and the story being told now about human worth. He let out a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something older, like the grinding of an empire's teeth. "Love makes monsters weak," he said again, but this time the words were measured differently, a question rather than an axiom. The hall watched for an order. The king's mouth framed the shape of command, and then, unexpectedly, he sat back down. The pause was a fissure. Lucien's voice, weak but gathering, filled the room as he spoke of a mother lost in fire and a throat sealed with ritual. Evelyn felt the crowd's edges soften in some places and harden in others. A conversation had begun that could not be unspoken. And in the middle of it, between accusation and denial, between power and plea, two people, one a prince who had been silenced, the other a waitress who had been ignored, stood and refused the scripts the city had written for them. After the uproar in the Hall of Ashes, the palace corridors felt quieter than they should have. King Aldrich retreated to a private gallery lined with portraits whose eyes seemed newly accusatory. For the first time in a long while, he sat with a decision that did not have an easy ledger. Power could demand obedience, but it could not, without consequence, simply erase the sight of a son standing and naming a wrong. He called for counsel and found his usual arguments tasting thin against the steady, public truth that had been spoken in the court. Cruelty had been disguised as protection. Outside, the city was murmuring like a hive newly awakened. Courtiers who had once smiled at gossip were suddenly watching one another. In parlors and shops, the story spread not as rumor this time, but as an event. A prince had been silenced, and a woman from a cafe had named it. Some dismissed the moment as youthful folly, an heir's temper frayed by affection. But others, quieter and more practical, listened to the moral arithmetic. A merchant whose livelihood depended on stable trade wondered what it meant to rule a city where the language of people was kept as a commodity. A midwife who had carried children into a world of strict inheritance thought of the ways silence had been used against women and children for generations. King Aldrich's public response was careful. He did not denounce his son outright. He did not have the stomach for a spectacle that might split the court. He sent bureaucrats to draft statements and tried to shepherd the scandal into tidy condemnations of impropriety rather than acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Yet the fabric of his authority had been tugged loose in one place, and cloth will not always mend neatly where hands of truth have pulled. The court watched Evelyn with a new kind of attention, not the predatory amusement that had come earlier, but a wary curiosity. Nobles who had favored elaborate disdain found, to their surprise, that people in Lumeris could be moved by something simple, a human-sized act of courage. Lucien, who had once occupied the world like a statue, moved differently now. He walked through the palace corridors with an awkwardness that no longer hid behind practiced composure. There was a warmth in his gait, the kind of warmth that comes from reclaiming something stolen. When he returned to the cafe that week, he did not drift in like a rumor. He came in deliberate, steadier footsteps, and the room recognized him not as an object of spectacle, but as a person who had spoken and found the cost. He sat at the corner booth and reached, without theatrics, for Evelyn's hand. Their fingers fit together as if they had been practicing to do so in the dark for a long time. People watched. At first the stares were the same old mixture of cruelty and disbelief. Then, slowly, they softened. A baker who had left rolls in the mornings now greeted Lucien by name. The woman who taught embroidery asked timidly if she could learn some signs for stitching patterns. Conversations grew curious where they had been cruel. The cafe, once a place that sheltered only those who needed to hide, began to look like something else, a modest bridge. News traveled to places that usually only heard of laws and taxes. A small council of merchants proposed a public forum to discuss what had been brought to light about lineage and the treatment of the vulnerable. Clerics from the east side came to see whether mercy could be married to law. Young people, who had always felt the city's rules as chains more than guidance, began to talk in ways that suggested they remembered an older word: hope. Evelyn's bravery had an odd, spreading quality. She had not intended to be a symbol. She had only intended to be honest in front of a man whose throat had been lawfully muzzled. But truth has a blunt, unstoppable appetite. People who'd once dismissed the lower classes as part of scenery found themselves, uncomfortably, face to face with how the city had been arranged to excuse cruelty. The vampire court did not fall in a day. Old habits do not unlearn themselves with a speech. Yet changes began that could not be easily undone. Guards were reprimanded when reports of rough treatment came in. A few nobles who had practiced petty cruelties were quietly advised to temper their displays, lest the market turn on favor. The king, recognizing that a crackdown would make a martyr of his son and inflame the very questions he hoped to bury, chose instead to reposition, publicly speaking of careful oversight and renewed commitments to the well-being of the household. It was a language that refused to say the word apology, but the landscape of action shifted in tiny ways that mattered. Less ritualized punishment, more eyes watching for abuse. The cafe took on a new air. Where once patrons had skirted the corner booth, now people lingered at it. Vampires, pale and still royal in their carriage, sat a little closer to humans, and humans found themselves laughing with a restraint that, over time, melted. Strangers who entered were greeted the way neighborhoods greet new mornings, with a cautious optimism. The lamp over the corner booth seemed to glow more often, as if proud of the small revolution it had lit. With Lucien's help, Evelyn opened a modest room above the cafe, a low-ceilinged space with windows that breathed in the street's smell of rain. She started classes 2 evenings a week. The first students were humble, bakery boys, a seamstress, a palace scrubber, people who had never believed the city had room for their voices. But the next week brought others. A junior courtier who wanted to prove he was not a bully. A pair of young nobles who found the practical language of gestures curiously elegant. And finally, to Evelyn's quiet surprise, Lucien himself, who came with a stack of books and sketches and a patience that made even her own teaching steadier. They taught together. Evelyn, with the warmth of someone who had shepherded children into literacy, and Lucien, who offered the peculiar gift of someone who had been denied the conventional gift of sound and learned to listen with every other sense. Lucien sketched phrases that described the arc of a carriage wheel or the shape of the moon. Evelyn named the signs and the stories behind them. Together they built a curriculum that did more than translate words. It taught how to meet another human being without assuming rank. The classes grew. People came to learn the gestures for I am here, I forgive, I hunger, and I love. They learned how to tell someone you were tired without shame, how to ask for help without confessional fear. The room above the cafe became a quiet hub where vampires and humans practiced patience in the same breath, where old prejudices were chipped at by the steady, tiny acts of communication. The city's language was not overturned, but a new dialect had been planted. Occasionally, King Aldrich sent emissaries to observe, officials tasked with ensuring the city's stability. They reported, with a kind of bureaucratic wonder, that trade seemed steadier in neighborhoods where people met each other, and that petty thefts had declined where neighbors felt more human to one another. Behind those careful reports were small, human things. A child learning to sign the word for bread without fear. An elderly woman finding a student to show her how to say, "Thank you," in a way that meant something to her. At dusk one evening some months later, after a long day of lessons, Lucien and Evelyn stood in the doorway of the cafe and watched the street stitch itself into night. Their hands found each other again, the familiar fit like the last piece of a puzzle. Around them, the neighborhood hummed, voices mixing, umbrellas folding, a violin's thin thread of music floating from a window above. He signed something simple, and the motion caught the light. Forever. She answered in kind, fingers moving with the ease of practice, and in the soft, public quiet of a city learning a new grammar, they sealed it. It was not a conquest of crowns or a rewriting of law. It was something quieter and more stubborn. Two people who had been taught to be small choosing to stand and hold hands in a world finally beginning, however slowly, to listen. Months later, the days folded into a quieter rhythm than either of them had known in the loud hour of scandal. Mornings smelled of coffee and warm bread, evenings of the lamp oil that had learned to be gentler in their neighborhood. Evelyn woke before dawn sometimes, not because duty called, but because there were pages of exercises to prepare, chalk dust to sort into neat piles, and a small room above the cafe that needed to be ready for hands that would come to learn something more dangerous than words: how to meet another person straight on. She moved through those mornings with a steadiness she had not been born with but had grown into, like someone who has practiced holding a fragile thing without crushing it. Her voice, once a hesitant thread that pulled at her like an old seam, had softened under the bank of time and practice. The stutter visited now as it had in years before, brief and familiar, a reminder of the life that had shaped her, but it no longer defined the space she occupied. When she read aloud in a classroom, the children watched the way her lips formed sounds and the way her hands made mirrors of them. And they learned, almost without realizing, that courage can wear the shape of ordinary speech. Lucien taught beside her. He walked the room with a patience that resembled a tide, slow, inevitable, shaping whatever it touched. His voice, recovered in the small miracle at the cafe months before, had gained texture and steadiness. It was still the voice of someone who had once been taught silence as a lesson, and that gave it a tenderness that made even the most practiced nobles lean in. When he spoke in front of a class, he used both sound and sign, switching from one to the other the way someone might change from one glove to another. Seamless, private, and perfectly natural. They taught more than signs. They taught how to ask for help without shame, how to ask for space without guilt, how to speak of hunger or exhaustion as practical facts rather than failings. They taught how to listen when someone's hands shook, how to let another person finish a story without interrupting, and how to hold someone's silence without assuming it was absence. The curriculum was half technique and half civics, and in it was the radical notion that language was not an asset reserved for the privileged, but a tool for human survival. The students came in a ragged, beautiful variety. Bakers with flour in their hair, palace pages with careful hands and quieter eyes, a seamstress who wanted to learn to tell a customer she needed more time, and once, to Evelyn's private thrill, a woman from the household who had once been a spectator in the Hall of Ashes. People signed awkwardly at first, fingers that belonged to other trades misbehaving under instruction, but those fingers learned. They learned because someone had shown them that the world could be different when words were no longer the only way to measure a person. On more than one evening, Lucien would linger after class, thumbs tracing the seam of the notebook that had once been a ledger of private pain. He would read passages aloud, snippets of books he loved, lines of music he had kept like contraband, and then sign them again as if to give the students both an echo and its shadow. He taught them to feel the cadence of a sentence in their chest as much as in their ears, and sometimes he laughed at a joke that the room didn't catch until Evelyn shaped it with two hands. The cafe itself had become a place of belonging. The corner booth where they had first met was no longer cordoned by hushed curiosity. It carried a little plaque someone had crafted and left one morning. "Here, all tongues are welcome." The plaque was the sort of quiet defiance that made the city close its mouth for a moment and think. Vampires and humans ate side by side under the lamps, speaking and signing and sometimes doing both at once. There were still those who could not, or would not, change, old prejudices like old stains, but their numbers were shrinking where meals were shared and hands were held across sugar bowls. Sometimes, when a traveler came in from a carriage district where rumors still had teeth, Evelyn would watch the way the newcomer's eyes slid over the room and caught on Lucien's profile. The traveler's discomfort might be visible for a breath, an instinctive recoil, but it would often soften when Lucien rose and greeted him with the same civility he offered to everyone. There were small victories. A noble who once sneered now asked for the sign for gratitude, in a voice that trembled with honesty. A child in a lace collar learned to sign friend and ran home proud. These shifts did not rewrite law or erase old harm, but they rewove the fabric of daily life, thread by patient thread. King Aldrich's presence, when it appeared in the story of the neighborhood, was a quieter thing than rumor had promised. He had not been toppled by the truth that had been spoken in the Hall of Ashes. Power seldom falls that easily. What changed was the air around his edicts, less unquestioned, more likely to be examined by people who had once accepted cruelty as custom. Occasionally, an emissary came down the lane with a formal gift and a curious question about the classes upstairs. Sometimes the palace sent a note of benign curiosity. Sometimes it sent complaints dressed as procedure. The city adapted by leaning toward conversation rather than silence. Between the lessons and the coffee service and the small household chores, Evelyn and Lucien built a life that was not a fairy tale of crowns and coronations, but an ordinary miracle. Two people who had been sidelined by the assumptions of their world choosing, every day, to stand at one another's side. They fell into rhythms. He would make a pot of tea and murmur a comment about a passage he'd read. She would fold napkins in the shapes of letters and leave them for students who needed a quiet reminder. They argued in whispers about small things, the best way to teach a sign, the flavor a new pastry should have. But in the evenings, they held hands in the sanctuary of quiet and practiced the single sign that had become theirs. Once, sitting beneath a lamp that had seen so many conversations, Lucien reached for Evelyn's hand and signed slowly, carefully, the motion he had used the first night they'd met. "Forever," he signed, fingers folding into a promise that had been quietly built out of shared danger and small mercies. Evelyn watched his hands, feeling the familiar map of their language beneath her palms, and then answered with a smile that touched the edges of her voice as much as her fingers. She signed back, returning the vow with her own certainty. Forever. The city outside their windows continued its imperfect turning, commerce, gossip, the occasional cruelty that lingered like weather. But inside the cafe, under the gentle, stubborn light, hands held, voices and signs braided together, and the small revolution of mutual seeing kept slow and faithful time. Once the prince could not speak and the waitress was not heard. Now the world listens because they dared to speak in silence. They closed their hands together and let the single, practiced sign settle between them, an ending that was, in truth, simply another beginning.